All right, everyone, we're on to topic 2.1. And so this is the first topic point of Unit 2, which is all about networks of exchange. And the first network of exchange is going to be the Silk Roads. So the essential questions I want you to answer for today is identify and explain the causes for the expansion of trade along the Silk Road or on the Silk Road. And then the second one is to identify and explain the effects of the expansion of trade on the Silk Road. So it's very clear what the questions are asking you today. So causes, effects, Silk Road, all right? So the context of the Silk Road is such it was established primarily during around the Han Dynasty, circa 130 BC. And, we don't know exact times and such, but what it started out was, just exchange between pastoralists and farming groups. And over time, it turned into like where these pastoralists were able to take what they got from one farm group and travel to a different farm group and trade. And so from time, we have this established trade network that does come about. But as far as where the Silk Roads began, about Han Dynasty, okay? And like I said, it's hard to narrow that down. The goal of this trade was to try to trade low weight to high value luxury goods. And so things like spices, tea, and of course silk were definitely things that were traded in large volume all on this trade network. And the low weight to high volume makes sense because you want to be able to carry as much as you can possible and then be able to make as much value from it at the same time. So silk certainly was one of those low weight, high volume, because silk was such a unique product that was only found in China for the longest period of time, and that it was traded because it was such a luxury good elsewhere because it's so rare, but it's very low in weight. You can put a lot onto a horse or a camel and take it a long distance to be able to trade in different markets. The use of pack animals was common along this. I mean, did people carry things? Maybe. But the more common way of moving this was by use of horses and camels. These pack animals, which you can put a lot on them and to walk around the great distances between the different stations along the Silk Road and so forth. And merchants would go from one city to the next, typically. It's very rare to where they would take the exchange of goods all the way from China to Constantinople, the entire length of the Silk Road. And so typically it would be merchants moving from one city to another. So the language of the curriculum is the growth of interregional trade in luxury goods was encouraged by innovations, change, in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies. Including the caravanserai, the forms of credits, and development of money economy. So let's talk about each one of these a little more in detail. The Silk Roads kind of really connected to a lot of the empires that we've already talked about and one we haven't yet. Okay, so the Silk Roads, they're moving these luxury goods, and they're connecting the empires of the Song Dynasty. They're connected through Dar al-Islam with the rise of the caliphates and control over much of the Middle East, because of the importance of trade and merchants within that society, certainly encourage more goods and people to exchange across distances. So the Silk Roads were tied into them very much so and protected by Dar al-Islam and the caliphates themselves, the Abbasids, the Umayyads a little bit. Much of the infrastructure of the Silk Roads would be destroyed by the Mongol conquest, something we'll talk about in the next topic point, which is 2.1. But in the 13th and 14th centuries, after they had conquered it, the Mongols would concentrate on protecting that trade and distributing wealth that would have been locked up in mosques and so forth and traded across Eurasia, and this has helped trade explode. So ironically, the empire that destroys the Silk Roads ends up becoming the ones who manage the Silk Roads to its heights in its history. So we talked about previous existing technologies that are going to be around, but then new innovations will also help move the goods across great areas and so forth. The use of pack animals, this is not a new innovation. It's been used in the previous and such. But things like the saddle and the stirrup. So the saddle, I don't have a picture right here. The saddle and the stirrup here. This allowed for bags and such, and people to be able to pack onto these animals more so than in previous generations. Naval technologies, these are new technologies in trade. They're not necessarily relating 100% to the Silk Roads, but doesn't mean that silk wasn't traded overseas and other things weren't traded overseas too. Something we'll talk about more with the Indian Ocean. So things like lateen sails, the rudder, the magnetic compasses, the astrolabe, and the Chinese junk ships all are important technologies that helped move trade and let trade expand during this time period. The caravanserai, which is another innovation. This is a new innovation that's coming around this time. And essentially, they were inns that were established about 100 miles apart in areas where you would find an oasis. Much of the Silk Road is desert and steppes, basically dry grasslands. So the amount of water and grazing food land or whatever it was for your animals was limited. And for you as a traveler yourself, as a merchant, you needed a place to be able to rest and recuperate from the difficult journey that took place in the Silk Road. So these caravanserai were basically like the early hotels. And so you come with your horses, your camels, you get them fed water and food, let them recuperate for the long journey. You do the same. And this is something that helped facilitate trade more so because it shortened the distance between markets and it made it easier for them to be able to travel along the Silk Roads because they could simply stop and rest and not exhaust themselves like they had in previous generations. And so this was a necessary innovation that helped expand trade along the Silk Road. Other things like the money economies, we start to see an exchange of goods using money or currency as a medium. And China had kind of already been using a money economy long before you find it along the Silk Roads. But then that medium exchange, using something that's an agreed medium of exchange, whether it's paper money, it's coins, or whatever, if two parties agree that they're going to exchange based off of this medium, this currency, then that facilitates trade even more so. And so there are like new examples of credit and money economies, stuff that's been used in the money economies that hadn't been used in previous generations. And there are the bills of exchange, the banking houses, and the paper money. So, the bills of exchange basically was like a written order that binds a person to pay another a set of money for the exchange of goods. Think of it as almost like early checkbook. And so if I go to the store and I agree, I'm going to pay this. And so here is like a bill of exchange. I hand this to you. And so you can take this as the agreement, how much money I'm going to give it to you. You take it to a banking house, and then you get from the banking house the actual currency from them. So it's like the early form of a check. I know your generation doesn't write checks anymore because everything's done electronically, but this is what it was. And it helps facilitate trade because you could, have these bills exchanged with you much easier than carrying your fortune with you all over, which causes problems with, probably being robbed and not having enough space on your animals to be able to carry your fortune as well as your goods. Banking houses, these are something that expands more so. They started in China during the Han Dynasty, but they began to spread westward all the way to Europe by the 1300s. And this is a place where people could hold their money, so they didn't have to carry it around. It was safer, it was more convenient. And so, if you needed to get your money out anytime, you can just go to the banking house, or if you needed somebody to come get your money from you, you can give them those bill of exchanges and such and said, this person agreed to pay me this money, gimme, and they take it from the banking house and move on. So, banking housing, once it gets to Europe and such, it definitely helps facilitate trade even more so, and especially in Europe and such. An example of an important family or peoples in history that really benefit from the banking house is the Medici family. And they were a very powerful, influential, and wealthy family in Italy, particularly Florence, Italy, that made their fortune in banking. They end up kind of helping fund much of the Renaissance arts that exists. Michelangelo, Raphael. I'm not going through all the Ninja Turtles. These are actual people who are, some of the most important artists of the Renaissance period in Europe, in Italy in particular. They were funded by the Medici family, who made their money in the banking system or creating banking houses. The use of paper money is also something that helped to expand and allow trade to facilitate much more so. It's made possible by woodblock printing and invention of China. And the paper money thing, it's paper. It doesn't have much value, but when it's like backed by a government that says this is a legitimate bill of exchange, a legitimate currency, it was easy to replace copper coins with, because copper coins are very heavy, burdensome, and so paper is much easier to store and much, much lighter, and so it's easier you and your pack animals. So paper money became a more convenient and a better medium of exchange than the carrying around the metal coins. So moving on to the next thing that it comes about, with the demands of luxury goods increased in Afro-Eurasia, Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants expanded their production of textiles and porcelains for export manufacturing of iron and steel, and expanded in China. So we talked about already in topic 1.1 that the Chinese especially had expanded their economy and become some of a proto-industry. And so the amount of manufactured goods had expanded much more so during the Song Dynasty. And so they're going to now take what they're making, and they're going to trade it at further away places. Improved commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade and expanded in geographical range existing trade routes, including the Silk Roads, promoting the growth of powerful new trading cities. So that's kind of the concentration of what we're going to talk about. More trade means more cities to where trade does exist. So we're going to talk about two examples that College Board has deemed necessary as an illustrative example. The first one is Kashgar, and Kashgar was a city that pops up during this time period, where much, as I mentioned, of the Silk Roads was primarily desert and dry grasslands of the Asian steppe. These cities, as kind of are become more important as places to where like trade can happen, because you can only go so far with your camels and your horses before they die of exhaustion or something worse happens to them. And so Kashgar is a new city that comes available, and it's in a significant city because it becomes the crossroads of the northern Silk Road route and the southern Silk Road route, where one goes further into the south and one goes north more into the Asian steppe. And so that crossroads, you've got people coming from different directions, and they're concentrating on Kashgar. So it becomes a very, diverse market that's getting products from all over the places that connect to the Silk Roads. Once it was a city, like early on in the existence of the Silk Road and such, Buddhism, it was a religion that traveled along the Silk Road. And so once it was a place where you had a lot of Buddhists and a Buddhist monastery, but as Islam becomes more connected to the Silk Roads and Dar al-Islam itself, you see it kind of transform over time to becoming more of a center of Islamic study, similar to kind of we talked about with Baghdad and Cordova in Spain. The spread of Islam comes with it lots of cultural exchanges, and Kashgar is another good example of that. Samarkand is another city that is now found in modern-day Uzbekistan. And another example of a city that is along the Silk Roads that becomes very cosmopolitan because of the number of cultural exchanges that occur there. And so it was kind of a crossroads itself of cultural exchange. And so when you kind of dig up the artifacts of Samarkand in its history and such, you find lots of artifacts that reveal that you had Christians living there, you had Muslims, you had Buddhists, you had Zoroastrians, all living in the city. And so you have all of this diversity, all living in close concentration with each other, leading to lots of cultural exchanges and so forth. Even today, Uzbekistan, which is primarily an Islamic community, and most of the people who live there are Muslim, it's still at a height was very diverse itself. The Bibi Kanim mosque, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that 100% correct sometimes, but this mosque right here is one of the most beautiful in the world. It has all this topaz that's kind of and this green stone, and geographical patterns, as you would find in a lot of beautiful mosques, but this one is absolutely stunning. The amount of work and detail that goes into the art of this particular mosque itself. It was built when it was built. It was one of the most magnificent, awe-inspiring architectural wonders of its time. So Silk Roads, that's pretty much the basics of the Silk Roads. We talk about, you have the causes, some of the effects. Here is something Freeman-Petty has put together. You can see here's Samarkand and here's Kashgar. They're connecting to China and Honshu and Beijing, going all the way. Here's Baghdad, which we talked about, with connecting to Dar al-Islam. It goes all the way to Jerusalem, Cairo, and of course the most eastern part of it would be Constantinople, which was part of the Byzantine Empire. So, great distance in which they are traveling and such, but nobody really travels the entirety of it, with the exceptions of a few people who record their journeys. Most people move back and forth between major cities. So Samarkand to Kashgar, Samarkand, Kashgar, and so forth, okay? Anyway, that is the Silk Roads in a nutshell. The essential questions: identify, explain the causes for the expansion of trade, and they explain the effects of the expansion of trade along the Silk Roads. So that's it from here. Make sure you respond in Canvas, and I'll see you next time where we get to talk about one of my favorite topics in AP World History, the Mongols.